Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Facebook Live. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Renee Birnberg Silberman. I am the daughter and daughter-in-law of 4 Holocaust survivors, and I am going to be sharing their stories with you today. So let me just get my screen up on your screen, and we'll get started. There we go. So what you see here is a picture from my wedding. There I am in my wedding dress with my husband by my side. My parents are seated on the left and my in-laws are seated on the right. And they are seated on the dance floor because in the Jewish tradition, when the youngest child in a family gets married, there's something that's done that's called a krenzl dance, where you place or put flowers on the parents' heads and all the guests at the wedding dance around them to celebrate that the youngest child in their family is getting married. And that was true for both my parents and my in-laws. And our wedding was one of the happiest days in all of our lives. Now, the 4 stories I'm going to be sharing with you are all unique, but they do share common elements of resilience, resistance, and luck. The first story I'm going to tell you is about Tobias, my father-in-law. Tobias came from a small town in Poland called Szczebrzeszyn. His father and his grandfather and he were tailors, and they were well known in the area for their fine tailoring work. Tobias got married and had a child and moved to a nearby bigger town called Zamosc, which you see here on the map. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Zamosc. And in 1940, the Nazis took men who looked young and fit to do slave labor. So they deported them out of Zamosc. And the first place that they took Tobias was to Belzec, which later became one of the 6 death camps that the Nazis used to exterminate Jews. Belzec wasn't open at the time that Tobias was sent there. He was sent to build the camp, which would later become a death camp. And after Belzec, Tobias was sent to Majdanek, which was another one of the 6 death camps. Tobias was sent to 4 more camps before he was eventually liberated in 1945. Most of his time he spent doing slave labor as a tailor, sewing uniforms for other prisoners. He was also given blocks of wood to carve out wooden clogs for prisoners. Somehow he was lucky enough to survive those 6 camps. But when he returned to Zamosc and then to Szczebrzeszyn, he learned that his entire family had been murdered. That's when he met my mother-in-law, Esther. Esther came from a very poor family in an area of Poland called Wladimir-Wolynsk, not far from Zamosc. When the Nazis invaded her area, Esther, who was just 14, 15 years old, ran. She escaped into the forests. When we asked her what she did during the war, she said, "I just ran." Sometimes she was lucky enough that someone would give her a drink of water or a piece of bread or a potato here or there. But she did find herself in the forest with other young people who were partisans or freedom fighters. And their goal was to do everything that they could to make it as difficult for the Nazis as they could to accomplish their goals. What that meant was sometimes killing Nazis, sometimes breaking up the railroad tracks that were used to deport Jews to the death camps. Esther was on the run, but one day she and friends from the forest went looking for food. And they came upon a farm that had a huge patch of tomatoes. And it must have been August because the tomato plants were very tall and very bushy and the tomatoes were ripe. So Esther and her friends started picking those tomatoes. But then they heard a truck coming and they knew that it must be a Nazi truck. So Esther and each of her friends ducked down behind the tomato plants, hoping that they wouldn't be discovered. But the Nazis must have seen the tomato plants rustling because they stopped the truck and they got out and they started yelling, "Get up, get up." And one by one, Esther's friends stood up, and one by one, they were shot dead. But Esther couldn't stand up. Her legs wouldn't let her move. So there she was, crouched down behind a tomato plant, and the Nazis never discovered her. They got back in their trucks and they drove away. And eventually, Esther was able to stand up. And eventually, the area that she had been running in was freed. And she went back to her town and found that her whole family had been murdered. So she was alone. But when she met Tobias, they decided to be alone together. They got married, came to the United States. They had a very small house, but a very big backyard. And every summer, they would plant 400 tomato plants in their backyard. And here you see Esther, Tobias in the middle, and a neighbor of theirs holding up Esther's prized tomatoes. Now I'm going to tell you about my father, Joseph. Here's another picture of Joseph. He's the young boy on the left with his hands behind his back. He's seated next to his mother, my grandmother. My grandfather is in the window with the beard and the hat. And two of the three of Joseph's brothers are pictured here for this picture. Joseph's family had a business weaving rugs and selling them all over Europe. And when Joseph went to school, he trained to be an accountant. He was going to be an accountant in the family business. He was barely 18 years old when he finished school. And that's when the Russians occupied his town of Kolomyja. You can see on this map that Kolomyja is a little bit further east, and the Russians occupied it first in 1939, but then in 1941, the Nazis came to occupy it. Under Soviet rule, Joseph's father's business was taken over. And when the Nazis came, it was believed that treatment would be worse under the Nazis than under the Soviets. So my father, like his father before him, who fought in the Austro-Hungarian War, my father decided to go to Russia and fight in the Russian army and fight against the Nazis that way. And you could see my father in this picture on the left. But the thing was, my father was a thinker, not a fighter. So even though he had been given a gun and he had been in some battles, he was actually injured in a battle, he kept telling his commanding officers how they could be more efficient with rations and supplies. He was an accountant after all. And his commanding officers liked that he had good ideas. And so they took him away from the front lines and they put him in the quartermaster's office. And that's how my father ended up surviving the war. When the war was over, he went back to his town of Kolomyja, and he found that his entire family had been murdered by the Nazis. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him a little later. The next person I'm going to tell you about is my mother, Mania. And I'm going to focus on her story. But before we get there, I want to show you a picture of Mania at a different wedding, at her wedding, as you can see here. There are my mother and father getting married. There are guests at the wedding. You see the wedding invitation. And all the way to the left of the picture, you see a woman in a black dress, a Polish Catholic woman. What was she doing at my parents' wedding? Mania grew up in a town called Zborow, not far from my father's town. Her family was very well off. They had several businesses in the town. They were very well known. They lived in a villa on the main street of the town. And my mother, her brother and sister and parents lived in one apartment. Her grandparents lived in another apartment. Her aunts and uncles lived in two other apartments, all within the same home. There were wide steps leading up to the front door of the villa. And in the summer, there would be window boxes in the windows bursting with red geraniums. In the home, there were beautiful herringbone patterned wood floors. And on the walls, there were paintings that were framed in frames that were painted in gold. My mother was raised by a governess, kind of a fancy nanny. And when my grandfather had to go to do business in the mayor's office of the town, the mayor would pull out a chair for my grandfather to sit down. When important rabbis came through the area, they stayed at my grandparents' house. And my mother went to Polish school. And even after the Soviets occupied her area and persecution of the Jews was happening in the schools and Jews had to sit in the back of the classroom, my mother was able to stay in the front of the classroom because that's how well respected her family was in the town. Here's a picture of my grandmother who spent most of her days doing volunteer work in the town. Here's a picture of her with Zborow's soup kitchen committee. On July 4th, 1941, the Nazis entered Zborow. They gathered together all the Jews in the middle of the town, and they took the most religious looking Jews, like my great-grandfather who wore a black velvet hat and had ringlets behind his ears, and my great uncle who showed the same kind of devotion to God with a black hat and ringlets behind his ears. They took those most religious looking people to wash their horses. My mother couldn't believe that her family was so well respected in the town, and here nobody was saying anything when the Nazis were making her grandfather and her uncle be humiliated into washing these horses. And then her grandfather and her uncle were shot in front of everybody. And that's when life changed for my mother and the town of Zborow. My mother was only 17 or 18 years old. All the Jews in Zborow were forced to move into a ghetto. My mother and her family had to leave the villa and go into this small part of town on the other side of the river and live in crowded conditions in the ghetto. Now, I want to tell you about somebody else at this point. His name is Wladimir-Wolynsk. He was a young Polish Catholic man who lived in Zborow, and he had just finished training to become a teacher. My aunt, who was older than my sister, she was in school to learn to be a teacher. And one of the people that she met at her school was Wladimir. Wladimir fell in love with my Aunt Regina. When the Nazis came to Zborow, they made Wladimir a member of the Polish police force. The Polish police force was set up to enhance what the Nazis were trying to accomplish in Zborow. They had to follow Nazi orders to do what the Nazis want accomplished. But Wladimir was in love with my aunt, and he went to my grandfather, and he said to my grandfather, "If you let me marry your daughter Regina, I'll take care of not only Regina, I'll take care of your entire family." My grandfather couldn't let his daughter marry somebody who wasn't Jewish, so my grandfather refused the offer. Wladimir shows up in the story a little bit later, so I want you to remember his name. Now the Nazis divided up the ghetto into a labor camp and a smaller living area. After all, they had begun taking Jews out into the open farmland and digging big pits and killing Jews in mass graves. My mother told one of my kids that she could actually feel the earth move because people were still alive in the pits. The family could still stay together at night, but during the day, labor was assigned according to age, and my mother's job during the day was sewing buttons on German uniforms. And she did that in a second floor room with windows that overlooked the opening of the ghetto to the road. While all this was going on, not far away, on farmland, there was a young Polish Catholic girl, my mother's same age, named Maricia, or Mary in English, who was helping on her family farm. Maricia's family was very poor. They just owned a small plot of land. And Maricia barely had shoes to wear. She went around barefoot most of the time. She cleaned people's houses to help make money. But she had a rough life. One day, she was working on the farm, and she saw a woman carrying a baby in her arms and holding a little girl's hands run up on the field. And the woman was saying, "Please help me. Please give me water. My baby's going to die. Please help me." And the woman was someone that Maricia recognized as a shopkeeper from another town, Golda. Golda was there with her infant son and her young daughter. Her husband had been killed and they were on the run. Maricia looked at them and she knew if she took them in, she would be hiding 3 Jews. She would be risking her family's life. I'll let Maricia tell you in her own words what she decided.
At Golda, she said she don't want to go no place. She's scared they're going to kill her, you know. She said, if I go someplace and they see they're going to kill me, I don't want to go. Could I stay, please? And I said, I don't know. This is a very, very bad time. What are we going to do? We have to do something. We couldn't throw the people outside like an animal you don't want to throw, you know. And that's what happened. And she stayed that time.
Maricia gave shelter to Golda and her children. She created beds for them in the attic of her barn. But like during any war, everybody was starving. It was difficult to get food. And Maricia expressed to Golda that she was afraid that it was too much for her family to share food with 3 more people. But Golda had an idea. She told Maricia that she knew of a family from Zborow that was very well off and that could probably find a way to get money to get food if Maricia would agree to hide the family. So Golda wrote a note to my grandfather, who was originally from Golda's same town. She wrote a note saying that Maricia would hide the family, and Maricia took it to the ghetto in Zborow and got it to my grandfather. That night, when the family was all together, my mother, her siblings, her mother and father discussed Maricia's offer, and they decided that my grandmother would be the first to go to check out the hiding place and make sure that there was actually enough room for everybody. So Maricia snuck my grandmother out of the ghetto and they started on their way towards Maricia's farm. The problem was that my grandmother was so well known in the town that when word started spreading that a very important woman had escaped the ghetto, the Nazis got wind of it and they said, if that woman doesn't come back by tomorrow morning when we do our count, we won't just kill her family, we'll kill 100 more people. Somehow word of that got to Maricia and she brought my grandmother back to the ghetto. Now, a couple weeks later, my mother was in that sewing room looking out the window. And at the entrance to the ghetto, she saw more Nazi trucks and motorcycles and dogs than would usually ever come into the ghetto. And she knew something was going to happen. So she and another girl that was sewing in the same room, they climbed out the back window and they climbed over a rooftop and jumped to a second rooftop and jumped to a third rooftop until they found a pole that they could shimmy down. And then they found themselves outside the ghetto fencing. My mother didn't know what to do, but she didn't look stereotypically Jewish. And she spoke perfect Polish because she had gone to Polish school. So when she would ask people, where can I find a piece of bread? Where can I find a drink of water? People would tell her where to go. But she knew where she really wanted to end up was at Maricia's farm. So what she did was she found Wladimir. And Wladimir took my mother to Maricia's farm. Now Maricia was hiding 4 people on her farm. When it got cold, Maricia dug a cellar in the floor of the barn. Polish farmers would usually put potatoes and onions in a cellar to keep them ripe during the winter. But now there were 4 people living in a hole under the ground, and they just sat all day and all night because they couldn't come out during the day. Nazis were patrolling the area. Some neighbors might see them. When they wanted to turn in the way that they were sitting, they all had to turn. Every night, Maricia would bring a clean bucket for them. And when Nazis would come around, Maricia would try and distract them with vodka or a little piece of potato cake. After more than a year, my mother was restless. She wanted to find out what happened to her family. She wanted to find out if her home was still there. Maricia felt bad for my mother because my mother was alone. And so she came up with a plan. She had had a cousin who died. So she told my mother, I'll give you my cousin's papers and you'll be my younger sister. I have to go clean houses and you'll go clean those houses with me. Now the houses that Maricia was cleaning were occupied by Germans that had taken over the area. So Maricia took my mother with her to clean one of those houses, and the Nazi officer was home. And the problem was, my mother never cleaned a house in her life. She was raised by a governess. She had no idea how to make floors shiny. She had no idea how to dust. She had no idea how to wash windows. And the Nazi was watching her and said to Maricia, who is this girl? Is she a spy? What is she doing here? And Maricia just said, oh, she's my stupid sister. Don't worry, I'll clean up for her later. But they were scared. When they left the house, Maricia said to my mother, we can't risk that again. He was too suspicious. As a matter of fact, that Nazi was so suspicious that he started sending people out into the area to find out if anybody else thought that there was a spy, if anybody else thought that there was something suspicious going on. And some neighbors somehow led him to Maricia's door. The Nazis came to Maricia's home and they asked her, where was the girl that she was hiding? And she said, I'm not hiding anybody. I don't know anything. But they arrested her anyway. And they started to take her away to the jail on a motorcycle. And other Nazis burnt down the barn. But somehow my mother ran out of the barn and she was walking down the street as Maricia was riding by on that motorcycle, holding onto the Nazi's waist. Maricia didn't look at my mother and my mother didn't look at Maricia. Maricia was taken to a jail 40 miles away. She was beaten black and blue for 2 weeks, but she never revealed that she was hiding anybody. After 2 weeks, one of the prison guards came to Maricia and said to her, it's your lucky day. The Russians are coming. We're leaving. We're opening up the doors to all the cells and you're free. You can leave. And Maricia did. She walked that 40 miles back to her farm, only to see the barn burnt down, not knowing whether the Jews that she had been hiding were alive or were dead. But now the area was occupied by Russians. It was liberated by Russians. And everybody felt free. So Maricia went to her neighbors and said, did you see a woman with a little boy and a little girl? Did you see another woman by herself walking? And people pointed Maricia in the direction of Zborow. So that's where Maricia went And that's where she found my mother, Golda, and Golda's children. I'll let you hear what she had to say about that jail experience.
Arrest me and take me to the jail and they beat me to death. I just thought, they catch me, I gonna die. Why somebody else have to die? If they could let them live.
When Maricia was reunited with Mania and Golda's kids, she said to them, "You are my family now, and I want to leave this place with you. Wherever you're going, I'm going with you." But here was the problem. Maricia was a Polish citizen. She couldn't travel between countries easily. The Jews who were stateless could. So Golda came up with an idea. She got papers identifying Maricia as a Jew. And that's how Maricia was able to travel freely, just like Mania and Golda. They made their way through Poland, through the Czech Republic, to a displaced persons camp, which would now be called a refugee camp, in Salzburg, Austria. Now, in the displaced persons camp, my father had already arrived there. My father, with his accounting skills and speaking 7 languages, he started working for the Joint Distribution Committee, and he was helping people regain their identities and get jobs and get papers so that they could leave Europe. I wanted to show you a few pictures of life in the displaced persons camp. On the bottom in the middle, you see the main road of the displaced persons camp. You see my mother and Maricia peeking out of their home window. On the top right, you see Golda and her kids who are now growing with Maricia. On the bottom, you see my mother and father and Maricia. And there's that wedding picture again, with Maricia being the most honored guest. And a year later, in the bottom left picture, my parents celebrated their 1-year anniversary in the displaced persons camp. Now, everybody was anxious to get out of Europe, and Golda wanted to go to the United States. My parents also decided that they would go to the United States. Maricia had heard about the United States because she had a cousin who had gone way before the war and sent back all kinds of beautiful things and sweet candies. So Maricia thought about going to the United States. But this is when she needed to regain her Polish identity, because it was easier for her as a Polish citizen to leave Europe and actually go to Canada. And so she ended up in 1948 going to Canada. My parents and Golda and her children left Europe and came to Chicago in late 1950, early 1951. Maricia missed her family, but she happened to be in a store and see a woman who was from Zborow. And she asked that woman if that woman knew where Mania and Golda went. And the woman said, yes, they went to Chicago. So Maricia went to a public library, got a phone book for Chicago, and found Golda's number. And she called and reunited. The first time that I know of that Maricia came to Chicago was in 1963 for my brother's bar mitzvah. Maricia was the most honored guest at the bar mitzvah. If it wasn't for her, my mother would never have survived. But that wasn't the only time Maricia came to Chicago. In years following that, she came and stayed at my mother's house, and she came for weddings and anniversaries and special birthdays and just to visit. I grew up with this hero in my mother's house, and my mother and Maricia were like sisters. They would cook Polish food together. They would go shopping together. They would laugh together. They would watch soap operas together. It was the most amazing childhood I had. Here's a little glimpse at what it was like having Maricia in Chicago. In 1982, Maricia was honored by Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum, as Righteous Among the Nations. The ceremony was held in Chicago, and I had the honor of being the master of ceremonies. Her medal says Mary Jewel, her English name. And when Maricia was honored here, it was covered by all the newspapers, all the TV stations, all the radio stations, and all the reporters asked Maricia, why did you do it? Why did you risk your life to save these 4 strangers? This is what Maricia said. She said, my mother taught me that God made all people the same. Everybody has the right to live. It was for that simple humanitarian reason that Maricia did what she did. Her respect of other human beings, her helping other human beings. When Illinois passed mandatory Holocaust education in the schools, National Louis University, which once was primarily a teacher's school, wanted to find a way to make it easier for teachers to bring Holocaust education into the school for young students. And what they did was they hired a children's playwright who researched all kinds of stories of the Holocaust and decided to write a children's play about Maricia called Angel in the Night, because Maricia was truly an angel in the night. So the characters in the show were Maricia, my mother, Golda, Golda's kids. Of course, there were Nazis in the story too. The play was performed, it premiered in Evanston, and it was performed all over the country, and it still is performed. And it really does bring to children not only the history of the Holocaust, but the lessons of history. There's a Jewish proverb that says, one who saves a life saves the entire world. Maricia saved my mother's life. She saved my mother's world and Golda's world. Because of the 4 Jews that Maricia saved, there are now 40 people who were inspired by what she did and who will work every day to make this world a better place. You know, when I tell this story to young students, I say to them, even in the deepest, darkest moments of history, there was goodness, there was light. Each one of us has within us the power to do good. Each one of us can make the choice to respect others, to help bring them to the light. That's what Maricia taught us. It's important to know the history of the Holocaust so that we can learn the lessons of the Holocaust. And one of those lessons is to make the choice to do good. We lost Maricia about 6 years ago in 2014 when she was too ill to travel to Chicago, and the last time she came to Chicago was for my mother's funeral. I took my kids to visit her in Canada. It was just when selfies started happening, and my son said to Maricia, just look here at this dot on the back of my phone, just look. And they took the most perfect selfie. Oh, and by the way, the newest member of the family, thanks to what Maricia did, is Mania, my first granddaughter. Mania Amalia, named for my mother and my grandmother. So I want to thank you for listening, and I want to open up the floor to questions if there are any questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Just a moment, we're going to give everybody a second to see if they have questions. We don't have any typed up quite yet, but an absolutely amazing story. I mean, it's so great you all got to have that relationship with her. I mean, that's just amazing. Give us just a second.
Thank you for the opportunity to share. My mother used to say, it's not a story, it's my life. And it's really an honor for me to be able to share that part of my mother's life, which wouldn't have existed without Maricia. And also, my in-laws and my father's slices of life during the war.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. We did have a question pop up just now. Who is the playwright of the play Angel in the Night?
Joanna, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna blank. Joanna Krause. She was based in New York when she wrote the play. She had come to Chicago to interview everybody, and she did hours and hours and hours of audio tape interviews of all the people that she wrote about in the play. And we were able actually to get copies of those audio tapes.
Wow.
And they're part of our family collection. And one thing that I do have to say was at the time that the play was being written and those interviews were being done was also the time when Steven Spielberg was having interviews conducted in all the major cities for the Shoah tapes, which some of you may be familiar with. And I said to my mother, I'd really like you to do one of those interviews for the Shoah Foundation. And my mother said, I told my story once, I really can't do it again. So she was never able to do a Shoah tape. So I'm glad we have the audio tapes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Another question that came in is, how did you meet your husband?
Kind of a funny story. I was finished with law school. He was finished with dental school, and we were each on vacations with our friends at a place called Club Med, which some of you might know, and for young people, you don't know, it was an all-inclusive vacation spot in the Caribbean. And it was the first night of the vacation, and this tall, good-looking guy came up to me at the disco, and he just looked at me and he said, "Are your parents European?" And I said, "Yeah, why? Are yours?" And he said, "Yeah." "Where are your parents from?" "Poland." "Where are your parents from?" "Poland." "When did they come to the United States?" And we were checking each other out, and we realized very quickly that our parents were all survivors of the Holocaust, and we had this huge piece of our lives in common. And we got married a year after we met, basically. So
amazing. Another question that's come in is, do you know if the play is around anywhere?
Yes, the last time we looked, it had been performed at a playhouse in California. So I think if you Google Angel in the Night play, you could probably find it. And I wish I could ask my son real quickly. I think that there is a script available. If not online, there's a way to get the script of the show.
Brilliant. I'll be looking for that. That looks like that's all the questions we have right now. So thank you.
Well, thank you again for tuning in, and join us here next Wednesday, July 15th, to hear second generation Holocaust speaker Judy Kolb share her family story. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post stream of content through the weeks ahead. And thank you very much for your support through this extremely difficult time. Thank you.